This is kind of a personal question. My father is in the National Guard, and he was on one of those lists that got hacked by ISIS and was leaked online, like all his personal information and things of that nature. How would the Geneva Conventions of Cybersecurity deal with a group like ISIS doing something like that? How would you respond?
The good news is that groups like ISIS are usually not the ones behind that kind of hack. In this case, the press has reported that it was the Chinese. The Chinese interest in SF-86 data is not to create a mess for individual Americans. The Chinese interest in having that data is, if you think about it, if you have somebody in an embassy abroad who doesn't have an SF-86 in this cache, that points, and you understand that elements of our intelligence community don't go through that SF-86 process in that batch, you can, by process of elimination, come up with a pretty good idea of maybe who's operating undercover. That's their interest. It's really a kind of a national security interest, as opposed to we're going to screw up your credit rating. I mean, the Chinese don't have much of an interest in that. That's cold comfort, I understand, because obviously if it can be gotten by the Chinese, who are very, very, very good at this stuff, it can perhaps be gotten by other people. And I will tell you, when I started to delve into the security protections and other stuff around this data, it's abysmal. I mean, we got a long way to go within the government in protecting this sort of thing. But your dad is probably more at risk from your garden variety identity theft than he is from the kind of sovereign, country-driven national security things.
Well, what kind of repercussions are there for those kind of acts?
Well, so I guess I'd say two things. One, you saw that the Obama administration indicted 5 members of the PLA, of the Chinese military, that they had identified as being part of a unit that was doing cyber attacks on the United States. Are they ever going to face justice in the U.S. court? Probably not, but that's a big deal when you actually name names, and name and shame is a pretty big deal. Because that hack didn't involve any immediate or even apparent harm, the U.S. has not retaliated in any way by shutting down networks or stealing information. No. Every country routinely spies on every other country. So we're also in a little bit of a funny position, because if you listen to some of the retired intelligence people, as awful as that hack was, because every country spies pretty much on every other country, for us to stand on a soapbox and say, you stole, we're some of our retired intelligence community people were grudgingly impressed by the success of the espionage that was undertaken. So it puts us in a tough position, right? I mean, particularly with the Snowden revelations, became pretty clear that we were more clear than it should have, that the U.S. is pretty aggressive about trying to get information that is national security valuable.
What should the president do as far as sanctions against Iran on their ballistic missile development?
I was a little disappointed in the administration's decision not to seek sanctions. I think particularly in the context of the Iran deal, which I supported wholeheartedly, spent a lot of time on it. I think if you start giving an inch this close to the signing of an agreement, you have a real possibility that the other side, or at least elements of the other side, the hardliners, will look to take a mile. So I'm sure the White House went through a very complicated calculation about how do we do something which signals our anger, but which doesn't derail the compliance that Iran has undertaken, and they really have undertaken. You saw a week ago they put 25,000 pounds, I may have the number wrong, of uranium on a ship to Russia. So I'm sure they did a big calculation using facts that I don't necessarily know. But on balance, based on what I know, I'm disappointed that the administration didn't say, you violated Security Council resolutions around ballistic missile tests, here is the consequence.
Presumably Kerry is in the midst of some sort of conversations with at least their foreign minister.
Yeah, I know they are, and again, I'll be a little bit humble about what he knows that I don't know, but I've watched the Iranians long enough to know that they will push right up to the line, conceivably put a toe over the line, and if you let that line slip, You're going to see increasing testing of that line. That makes me uncomfortable. The agreement is still controversial enough in this country that if you see that kind of testing, you know, at some point people might, you know, call for drastic action that would put us in violation of the agreement. I think that agreement's really important.
Jim, one of my, recent concerns about the Middle East are the Saudis, and what's going on with them in Iran. What is your view about the recent events there?
Yeah.
Because they are one of, I've always felt quite uncomfortable with the fact that they are one of our important allies, and given their record, and the situation now is making me very uncomfortable.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I share your concern, maybe even cynicism about the Saudis. I mean, Happy New Year, we just executed 147 people, including an Iranian Shiite, cleric, which they had to have known was going to lead to the kind of violence that we've seen now in Tehran and the breaking, I don't know if they knew they were going to be breaking of diplomatic relationships. But look, let's be clear on this. It's important we be clear on this. We call Saudi Arabia an ally, and they have been an ally in certain important respects. But the deal they made with the devil, and by the devil I mean their Salafist, Wahhabi religious extremists, is at the root of most of the terrorism that we're dealing with. And I want to be clear about that. It's not that the Saudi government is out there sponsoring Al-Qaeda or whatever, but in Muslim communities throughout the world, because of the deal they made with their own extremists, if you will, their Salafists and Wahhabis, there are madrasas and funding and clerics who are spreading the most extreme, austere, medieval version of Islam from Indonesia to Morocco. And it goes beyond that too, in as much as certain Saudi private individuals, organizations, and Gulf individuals and organizations have been directly funding the kinds of terrorist groups that we're now fighting. And so, I've said for a while now that I think we need to be a little more clear with the Saudis that this deal they made with their Wahhabis and this promotion of extremist ideologies is a national security threat to us. And while I don't want to get called naive, and I'm not naive about this, the possibility, and it really is a possibility, maybe even a remote possibility, of a diversification of our attention in the region, I deliberately don't use the word alliance, of our attention in the region towards Iran, if Iran behaves, can be a good thing. Iran is a terrible, terrible regime. They sponsor terrorism throughout the region. They're, of course, not alone in that. They execute homosexuals in Iran, appalling regime. But in the who sponsors the most terrorism derby, it's not clear that they win. And so, again, I don't want to come off as naive or as believing that necessarily there's going to be a rapprochement between the United States and Iran, but at least the opening of a possibility of discussions with a country that does have an internal politics, where, believe it or not, in Iran, polling shows that they actually like us, I think is a nice counterbalance to our over-reliance on Saudi and Gulf regimes as allies in the region.
Is there anything, any change we could make as far as what's going on with Russia and their bombing and so forth in Syria? Is there any way to dissuade them, or are we basically just going to have to let them take over at least a section of that country?
Our interests in Syria, they look like they're opposed. They're a lot less opposed than you might think, for two reasons. One, Russia has as intense an Islamic extremist problem as we do. So, in fact, it's worse in some regards, because they've got Chechnya and Dagestan right on their border there. And there are a lot of Chechens in Syria. There are a lot more Chechens in fighting in Syria and getting trained than there are Americans. So we have aligned interests with the Russians in quelling the chaos and going after ISIS. Believe it or not, it is my belief that we also have an aligned interest with the Russians in a post-Assad future for Syria. The Russians support Assad. He embarrasses them. it's sort of hard to be in alliance with somebody who uses chemical weapons on their own people. And so I don't think the Russians shed a tear when he finally goes somewhere, including possibly Russia, so long as their interests are maintained. What are their interests? Their interests obviously are the naval base at Tartus, which is one of the things we may not like, but they're going to get to keep in a final settlement, I suspect. So my point is that our interests are actually more aligned with the Russians than it feels like. And we also, before we start, and I get this in town hall meetings all the time, before we start thinking that Vladimir Putin is this master Machiavellian chess player, that he's this strong man, so make no mistake, he's acting from a position of profound weakness, right? His economy is in the dumps. He sits on a very unstable political situation, and so he's using the old techniques of, taking his citizens' eyes off the balls in area where he knows he's not going to actually have to directly fight NATO, because that would be pretty catastrophic for him. I think he calculated rightly that we weren't going to put troops on the ground to prevent the seizure of Crimea. And what he's doing right now is again, not likely to cause a face-off. So, he's in a position of real weakness, and we should, as we think about how to respond to him, we need to remember those two things. We have more in common in terms of interest with him than we have in opposition in Syria. And, it's not like he's going to roll tanks into Poland, as we worried about 40 years ago.
What about the Chinese now have finished a runway on one of their artificial islands? They've landed a plane there. Should we step up our opposition? Should we be sailing ships through the South China Sea to bug them about that?
I think the president's gotten it about right in terms of the reaction there. I think we need to revert to international law, and international law is pretty clear on who owns what in that part of the world. And I also think it's worth our doing what the president has been doing, which is sailing frigates, within the 12-mile zones of these islands, these atolls or whatever, these new landing strips that they've built. But I also think we got to be very, very careful. And in some regards, I almost worry more. I was with a Pentagon friend of mine last week, and he said, what worries him more than terrorists, as he put it, it's Chinese and Japanese ships swapping paint in the South China Sea. And so, what worries me about that is more the possibility of miscalculation than of a deliberate outbreak of hostilities. Again, in this, we got to always remember the common interests that we have. The Chinese are getting wealthy. They're growing a little less fast than they've grown in the past, but they are developing like all get out. They have trade relationships with everybody in the region. A shooting war in the South China Sea brings that to a screeching halt. China's political stability, a very clear deal, right? You, Mr. Chinese guy, you don't get a voice politically. You don't get to say anything about the government. In exchange, we're gonna grow your standard of living beyond your wildest dreams. A shooting war in the South China Sea brings that equation to a halt. So not only now do they have economic problems, but they've got severe political problems. So it makes me nervous, particularly with respect to miscalculation, but it doesn't make me nervous that there's going to be sort of a deliberate attempt to foment a war. And I just think we got to keep pushing back with law and with a clear demonstration that we're going to work with Japan and Korea and other countries in the region to not allow them to decide that the South China Sea is a Chinese lake.
Tim, a lot of us probably went to see The Big Short over the break, and today the market's down 400 points because China is, their market's down. I know you're on the House Financial Services Committee. Do you feel confident that we are, how do you feel that about us? Are we protected in any way that we aren't going to face another, has Wall Street been sufficiently contained from the kind of abuses that went on that led to 08?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's important to acknowledge that stock markets are going to be volatile. It's what they are, and we are more connected internationally with other economies and therefore other stock markets than ever before. So.
Yeah, but there's a difference between regular volatility and what essentially was packaging bad loans and not marking them down
Yeah.
And, you know, when essentially it was fraud that wasn't really ever, no one was ever prosecuted for.
Yeah, which remains very much an open sore. You know, this is a hugely complicated discussion. When it all comes down to it, there's still so much emotion around the idea that really nobody was held all that accountable for for decisions that range from the mildly irresponsible to the probably very criminal. You know,
Definitely very criminal.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other interesting topic. I mean, you know, this administration, obviously, when they came in, you know, politically speaking, if they could have prosecuted somebody big, individuals, it would have made a lot of political sense. And I think they looked at it, and what was even more horrifying than the notion that somebody broke the law was that actually a lot of the truly crazy fraudulent behavior at the time wasn't against the law. But let me step back to try to answer your question. There's no question in my mind, Sarah, that the financial services industry is a heck of a lot safer than it was in 2007, 2008. We don't see the kind of asset bubbles that, you know, were in real estate. I mean, we all felt this with the value of our own homes. It was absurd what things were trading at. The mortgage market has been very meaningfully reformed, so much so that people are squawking a lot about how impossible it is to get a mortgage. The banks have had stress tests imposed upon them by the Federal Reserve and by the Financial Stability Oversight Council that have indicated that they're in pretty good shape from a capital standpoint. They're now holding much larger capital buffers than they did certainly back in 2008, even more than a couple of years ago. And as new rules get written, those buffers just go up. So there's no question in my mind that the financial services industry is more safe than it was in 2008. That doesn't mean I'm willing to say that, you know, too big to fail is gone. We still have these behemoths, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citibank, that if they were to surprise me, and it would surprise me, frankly, given the intense scrutiny that these institutions are now facing by everybody, by the Financial Services Oversight Council. If we woke up one morning and Citibank was on its back, I think it's an interesting question about whether there would be whether the whole structure set up by Dodd-Frank, whereby they would be resolved, as they say in that industry, whether it would work. I can't sit here and say, oh, too big to fail has been solved. I don't know that I believe that. But from the origination of mortgages, where mortgage brokers used to get paid more for selling you a more expensive mortgage, I mean, think about that, right? And it was often the more distressed, lower income communities where people had fine credit ratings, but they were paying subprime mortgages because the brokers got paid more for it. That's gone. The credit rating agencies that stamp AAA ratings on a lot of this toxic stuff have been overhauled in a very meaningful way. You now have new entities like the Financial Stability Oversight Council, designations like systemically important financial institutions. You have this whole apparatus that didn't exist before that I think on every link in the chain has made for more safety. But again, it's such a concentrated industry that I can't then make the leap to say, oh, no problem.
Yeah, because do you still have the foxes guarding the hen house? You know, like, is it still people from the industry guarding the industry because?
Well, I don't believe. I mean, you know, I don't believe that. You know, I mean, the Federal Reserve they're responsible regulators. You know, ask the industry what they think of the director of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. I know Mary Jo White she worked at Davis Polk and this and that, but, you know, she's tough as nails. I don't. What worries me more than fox guarding the hen house is just sheer complexity. Just sheer complexity. I'm not sure any person or any CEO or any, you know, room full of regulators is smart enough to really be able to understand the deep inner workings of a derivatives trading desk or something. So that worries me a little bit. And by the way, there are areas that worry me. The areas that worry me are not the mortgage market. The areas that worry me are student loans, where the exposure has gone up, and there's a lot of reasons to worry about that. But also auto lending. Auto lending was actually carved out of Dodd-Frank in terms of getting strong regulatory oversight. And surprise, surprise, there's some pretty nasty things happening in the auto lending market.
Have you seen the movie?
I haven't seen it yet. I read the book. I haven't seen the movie yet. I will.